Republicans in North Carolina are trying to steal a state Supreme Court seat election. Justice Allison Riggs, the Democrat who won that election, is here with me today. Welcome back to Democracy Docket. I'm Marc Elias. Let's get started. Justice Allison Riggs, welcome back to Democracy Docket.
Thank you so much for having me, Marc.
All right, you and I talked, I don't know how it feels like forever ago, but it probably wasn't that long ago, about the election that you won. And let me just state at the beginning, you won the election. I know that because after the vote counting, you had won the election. After the recount, you had won the election. After the second recount, you had won the election. There have now been a flood of legal efforts by a combination of your opponent, who is a Republican. And again, just a disclaimer to everyone listening, I'm not calling him a Republican in some characterization. In North Carolina, thanks to the Republican-led legislature in North Carolina, state Supreme Court justices have to run in partisan elections. So your Republican opponent came up with this theory relatively early on to disenfranchise 60,000 voters after they had voted in North Carolina. This is a crazy theory. It doesn't make any sense, and it has essentially been rejected at the State Board of Elections and at the counties to the extent they have considered it. I don't want to bore people with all the back and forth here, but when we last talked, I thought we were heading towards a resolution in which that would be that, that he had floated this theory, it kind of didn't hold together, and we would proceed with, the swearing in and move forward. So bring everyone up to speed. Where are we right now in North Carolina?
So today, my certificate of election was supposed to issue. The North Carolina Supreme Court, on which I sit, in a case where I recused myself because it would obviously be inappropriate for me to decide my own election, stayed the certificate of election. So I continue to hold over in my seat. I was appointed to the Supreme Court in 2023. As you mentioned, I won election in November of 2024, but I still don't have my certificate of election and commission. What happens after you're elected to ensure you keep your seat and that voters get what they want, which is the person they elected serving the full term. So we have had, like you said, a flurry of legal actions.
Before we go to the litigation, I want to pause because not everyone, our audience tends to be pretty legal savvy. But if you could just unpack for us. So certificate of election, as everyone knows, because we've all dealt with this with Donald Trump and his nonsense and others, that after an election, there is some piece of paper that is formed that says, here is the winner, and, governor, secretary of state, I don't know who it is, stamps it and signs it and whatever. But you're still in office. So can you just unpack to people like what all of that is, what that process is and where we are in that process?
Yeah, I mean, some of your listeners, some of the public may not have heard of this idea of certifying an election since 2020, or that might have been the first time.
Exactly.
On January 6th. What caused that rioting and that violence was people trying to stop the certificate of election from coming out of Congress. And so at the state level, there's not exactly the same process, but the election officials certify to other branches of government that these are the election results. This person has won election, and then they take the oath to serve their new term, whether it's a 2-year, 4-year, mine is an 8-year term. So right now, not only I'm holding over because our Constitution says the incumbent holds over. So I'm continuing to do the work every single day. But my opponent is also suggesting that anything I do on the court somehow can or should be overturned or undone. I sign orders every single day on the court. So I want to emphasize the potential for disruption here. But at core, it goes back to the voters made a decision 66, 67 days ago. We still have not given effect as we ought to as a functioning and healthy democracy to what the voters decided. And I ran on a campaign of transparency. It is critical to how I approach serving on the bench. And so I think it's important that not just my fellow North Carolinians, but people across the country understand what is happening here in North Carolina, because I worry it can be replicated, will be replicated. And when I was trying to get folks to pay attention to this even a month or two ago, I think people thought this was a fringe strategy, not likely to get any traction, and I think it's portends poorly for the direction of my state in this country.
Yeah, so we're going to talk more about that in a second. But so you mentioned that the state Supreme Court did something. They issued a stay, which for, again, people who are not lawyers, that means they essentially blocked that the certification or the swearing in, the what did the Supreme Court do, and why did they, to the extent you can say, why did they do what was the ask of them? How did we wind up here?
So a few weeks ago, and I'll report that I'll share this. Just it's the facts of what happened. A few weeks ago, my opponent filed an original action in the North Carolina Supreme Court, so not an appeal, an original action in the North Carolina Supreme Court asking them to stay my certification. So staying my certification means pausing the final steps of the electoral process, the normal electoral process. So it means I don't get my certificate of election. I can't take my oath. I can't start my full 8-year term. I still hold over. The State Board of Elections was a defendant in that case. They removed it to federal court. The State Board of Elections said this issue is about compliance with the National Voter Registration Act, the Help America Vote Act, UACAVA, enabling uniformed and overseas citizens to vote. And then this past Monday, a federal court, Chief Judge Myers in the Eastern District of North Carolina, said, yes, there are federal questions. I have jurisdiction, but I'm choosing to, the legal term is abstain. And so he sent it back to the state courts. And there were multiple actions, but this one particular one he sent back to the North Carolina Supreme Court. And on Tuesday, January 7th, he did that on Monday, January 6th. On Tuesday, January 7th, the Supreme Court, the North Carolina Supreme Court allowed the stay. So now they've set a briefing schedule for the parties. And I have intervened in the case. So I am a party in the case defending my win, my seat, and through that, the will of the voters in the state, set a briefing schedule that wraps towards the end of January, but there's a pending appeal in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals right now about that federal district court judge's decision.
Okay, so where we stand right now is that the majority of the state Supreme Court, yourself excluded, obviously, has voted for this stay. And for people who don't know, the court is it's a 7-person court. It has 5 Republicans, 2 Democrats, Justice Riggs being one of the 2 Democrats on the court. Again, for everyone, that's how they run. It's not my characterization. And the 5 Republicans are pretty partisan Republicans. I mean, this is not like and I've said this in other videos, like this is not like the Pennsylvania Supreme Court where you have nominally you have 5 Democrats, but you get these like opinions where some Democrats vote against voting rights, some vote for voting rights. You look at the prior court cases. Okay, I'm not talking about the future. I'm talking about the prior court cases. And you look at the ID case or the felon disenfranchisement case, the Republican justices have been pretty consistently, in my opinion, anti-voting. Okay. The reason I give you this setup is because actually one of the two votes, there were 2 justices who dissented from this stay, and one of them was actually a Republican justice who this apparently was even too far for him. Without agreeing with my characterization of your colleagues, is that right? It was a 4-2 vote.
There were 6 members of this court will be deciding this issue. Justice Earls, the Democrat other than me, and Justice Dietz dissented from the stay.
And Justice Dietz is a Republican member of the court, as I mentioned.
He is.
Okay, so like, look, everybody, and again, this is me, this is not the justice speaking. I have said this before, and everyone needs to be paying attention to this. The Republican Party is trying to steal this election. That is just straight up the facts. I mean, I have been involved in more post-election disputes than anyone in this country, probably ever, but certainly today. And 4 years ago, everybody understood that when Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell and Jenna Ellis, when they were running around the country saying throw out 11,000 votes in Georgia, that was wrong. When they were saying throw out 17 or 18,000 votes, I think it was, in Wisconsin, before also a very conservative state Supreme Court, everyone said, you know what, the conservatives have to do the right thing and can't, after the fact, throw out 17,000 votes from people who did nothing wrong because the Republicans now want to manufacture that there was. I could go state after state after state. 4 years ago, this was a failed strategy, and we all celebrated democracy that it was a failed strategy, and the legacy media is not doing its job here to call this out. So I need all of you first, and I'm going to do this early in the video, I'm going to do it at the end. I need everyone here to help support the effort here that Justice Riggs has in fighting this fight. Because if we let this happen here, you may not live in North Carolina, you may not be a lawyer, and you may say, it's the Supreme Court. If this happens here, I'm just telling you something, guys. We're going to have this. This is, once they can throw out 60,000 votes anywhere, they're going to be throwing out 60,000 and 80,000 and 100,000 votes everywhere. And if you thought we beat this for good in 2020, well, I'm telling you, it's back. So Justice Riggs, early in the video here, I wanted to get to this. How can people, what can they do? Obviously, they can write letters to the editor. They can, if they're in North Carolina, I don't know if there's someone for them to call. I don't know if they show up at hearings. But I know also these are, lawyers are not cheap these days. There are other things that you probably need them to do to support the legal effort. So tell people what can my audience do to help?
So if you go to my website, riggs4ourcourts.com, you can support my campaign. I'll have, and I can send to Mark for posting the link for my legal defense fund as well, which is a separate entity. Yes, the lawyers are expensive. I want folks to understand we have been fighting this in front of the county boards of elections, the state board of elections, state courts, federal courts. This has been nonstop for over 2 months now, and it's going to be at least another month or two. It is expensive. Our democracy is worth this. This is absolutely something with national implications, and so very much need folks' help. I am not backing down. I am a constitutional officer. I put my hand on a Bible and swore an oath before God that I would defend and uphold our state and federal constitutions. What I am doing now is upholding the oath I took and the work that people in the state elected me to do.
I'll be right back with more of my conversation with Justice Allison Riggs in a moment. Democracy Docket relies on your support to provide fearlessly independent, unapologetically pro-democracy news, information, analysis every day through its free daily and weekly newsletters and through its paid premium content. Become a paid premium member today. You have dedicated your entire career to making sure the lawful votes count, right? I mean, like, the irony here is that you and I first met not as someone who appears before courts and someone who's on a court. You and I met because we were both very concerned about a North Carolina law that had been enacted that was quite discriminatory against voters in general, but black voters in particular. And we met in a courtroom in Greensboro, either in Greensboro or Winston-Salem. I can't remember.
Winston-Salem.
This is, I feel good that I get the two associated, but that's the limit of my North Carolina, my North Carolina trivia. But you've spent your entire career fighting on these issues. So, I don't want to ask you, how does it feel to now be on the other side of it as like the kind of the candidate? But what do you make of this from like a trajectory as you see this through the through line of your career and the injustices and the challenges that voters have had? How do you see this?
I spent 15 years as a civil rights attorney with a focus on voting rights. I know what disenfranchisement looks like. When we had arguments in front of the State Board of Elections, my opponent's counsel stood up and said, well, we don't want to disenfranchise people. We just want to correct the vote count. And as someone who's represented voters who get treated like pawns in political games, I'm offended at the sanitizing of what's happening here. The right to vote and to have your voice heard is a fundamental, precious right. And our democracy only works if those in charge respect the will of the voters. It is not easy being a political candidate. It's not easy going through any of this. But when we sign up for it, knowing that if we lose, those are the breaks. Like, that's what we move on with. But My parents got a letter that they were among the 60,000 challenged. And so I'd had personal experience walking voters through when someone was trying to disenfranchise them. I recognized in my parents the fear and the frustration. And I feel in some ways uniquely equipped to withstand this barrage. And I know at core, this isn't about me. It's about making sure that we are in control of our own political destiny, that all the power that our government holds is vested in the people, and they make themselves heard via casting a ballot at the ballot box. This is too big. There are too many real people, our friends, our families, our neighbors. And I know what they're going through, and I consider it to be part of my constitutional duty to make sure that I'm standing up for everyone's constitutional rights.
Right. Again, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds in the categories, but just to remind people, and Greg, correct me if I am misstating this, among the groups of voters they are targeting are military and overseas voters and their families. That essentially what you refer to as UACAVA voters. And the utter hypocrisy is apparent, but the idea that they are targeting these folks who are, whose circumstances bring them abroad, either because they're serving in the U.S. State Department or because they are in the military, or they're the children of people who are stationed abroad or in the military or relatives. How does, again, you could approach it from like a legal standpoint. I'm sure you could probably school all of us, myself included, on why what the statute protects and why this is wrong. But just take a step back and reflect a little bit on what it means to have a case where the other side is saying we need to disenfranchise people for the circumstance of them or their families being stationed abroad.
Yeah, I think there's two things that are deeply problematic about this. One, that we would take any action to undermine the political voice of the people who are putting their lives on the line to protect our very freedoms. And beyond that, folks who are serving in the military and their families stationed abroad, the rules were posted well before the election that people who were deployed, serving abroad, they didn't have to make a physical copy of their ID and mail it overseas to a county board of elections. There was no question that was going to be how the counties administered the election before the election. It's only after the election, after some of those overseas voters called North Carolina to confirm what they had to do to comply, were told, pursuant to the publicized rules, and complied with every rule. And changing the rules after the election is unfair no matter who you do it to. But doing it to the folks and their families, putting so much on the line for each and every one of us, I think that's a story worth telling, and one, as someone who comes from a military family myself, my father, my brother have served overseas and in wartime. And this is a story that I have personal experience with and want to make sure that everyone in this country knows what's happening here in North Carolina.
Yeah, and it's interesting because this is part of why I am so outraged by this set of facts and why I'm outraged by the lack of clear moral coverage of this by too much of the media. To give people the through line here, I want to give people just a little bit of how I see this. So in 2020, the state of Wisconsin allowed registration to take place. And essentially what you would think of as site registration. They did a series of events. One of them, the most important one for these purposes, was called Democracy in the Park, where people could come and register in a big park. I don't even remember which city it was. The Republicans didn't complain. Donald Trump didn't complain. No one complained. They're, oh, good. That's good. They're having an event in a park, register people to vote. What could be wrong? And after the election was over, okay, and Donald Trump had lost, his lawyers went all the way to the Wisconsin Supreme Court saying that everyone who had registered at Democracy in the Park, which I think was like 17,000 people, those people should not have been allowed to register because of their new reading of a law. I, by the way, didn't agree with their reading of the law, but setting that aside, like the idea that people were sort of like enticed into doing this thing because the government, the state says you can do this thing. Nobody said boo about it at the time. And then they do it. And then after the fact, a candidate walks in and says, oh, wait, you should now discard all those ballots, um, is like just fun. Not only I mean, I'll say it's completely illegal and unconstitutional, but it's also like wildly unfair. And tell me if I'm wrong, Justice Riggs, that's essentially a different fact pattern here, but that is essentially what is at issue with these 60,000 votes. These are not illegal ballots. These are not like, there's nothing sketchy about this. These are people who actually followed the procedures that they were told to follow. Then now the Republicans have come up with kind of a different interpretation of the law. Again, I don't agree with that interpretation of the law, but in any event, it's just that they think that what these voters were told should have been something different.
Right. And I think one thing that's important to emphasize too is that my opponent cannot point to one single voter that he says that person is ineligible to vote. And in fact, what we've seen are people like my parents, Democratic and Republican elected officials alike, members of our military, members of our state who live in areas ravaged by Hurricane Helene, eligible voters being attacked based on some theory about the law that wasn't what they were asked to show, to prove. And, I just had this conversation with my mom last night, and she just cannot wrap her head around. She's like, but when I went to vote, I handed them my driver's license. And so why are they saying that I didn't give my driver's license number? And I was like, they're now saying the county board didn't record it. So you have it, you presented it, they didn't record it. My mother is an eligible lifelong voter. And I share that because I think a lot of people are having these questions and wondering and frustrated. And it's not just the lawyers and the voting rights lawyers who know that there's something fundamentally unfair about changing the rules of the game after the game has been played.
Okay, so you mentioned lawyers and voting rights lawyers. What is the reaction in state? How do you feel like? Do you feel like you're getting the support you need in state? Do you think, like, are people paying attention to this? Like, because, I want to do everything we can do here to be helpful to you. So if there's things we can do to raise the profile of this nationally, obviously that's something, I want this podcast and others to be helpful with. But what's the reaction in state to all of this?
I think this too. When you're talking about complex legal, and multiple lawsuits, legal procedure, federal court versus state court, folks have a hard time understanding that if they didn't go to law school. That's totally reasonable. My mother didn't go to law school, and she has a daughter who's a sitting Supreme Court justice explaining things to her. Not everyone has that, but I need folks like you and others to reiterate, because sometimes people don't quite get it the first time. And there's a reaction that I'm observing that is, this situation we find ourselves in is so absurd. People ask me, wait, what am I missing?
Right.
And there isn't a good answer for that, but I think it helps even people in state to have support out of state, for people to recognize that the hard work that we're doing here in state is valued and seen as protective of democracy all across the country. That solidarity would be huge. This is obviously quite expensive, but lots of people have friends and know people in North Carolina. I urge you to go online. There's multiple places now where you can scroll through the list or search names on the list. If you have friends in North Carolina, put their name in the list. See if they're on the list, because every single day I'm getting emails. My campaign accounts are getting emails of folks who literally just say, January 9th, January 10th, I found out that I'm on the list. I hadn't realized that. So every day we're just getting more and more people who are outraged, want to share their story. And in addition to support. You can help us identify those folks and lift up their stories because they're real people. They deserve not to be treated as a pawn in a political game. Voters have spoken, and we need this to end.
Yeah, and one of the concerns I have about what is going on here, I mean, I have so many concerns, but one of the concerns I have is that, we tell folks for months and months, you got to make sure you're registered. You got to make sure you got a plan to vote. You got to make sure you got the rules to vote. You got to make sure you turn out to vote. And don't worry, if you do that, your vote's going to count. Like, we give that assurances to people because we mean it. Like, and because it's important that people vote. Well, if someone wakes up in January after the election and their vote didn't count, like, are they going to vote again? Like, 2 years from now, 4 years from now, or 6 months from now, like, people are already cynical about politics. And so, this is very, very important, everyone, that we not let, you hear me say this to you guys all the time. Don't let the cynics win. The cynics want you to believe that your vote doesn't matter because they think they can win if they can convince all of you to give up on protecting voting rights, give up on keeping your legislature honest, give up on paying attention to what's happening in the courts. Like, they want you to give up. And what better way to get people to give up than to prove to them that after an election you can throw out 60,000 votes. So my view, not the justices, my view is, this is an election that Republicans lost by 700 and some odd votes. Note, they're not challenging 800 votes. They're challenging more than 60,000 because they want you to give up. They want to get their way of showing that they can do something big and disenfranchise tens of thousands of voters because they think it will aid their cause to undermine the future of democracy. Okay, enough on my soapbox. Justice Riggs. So as we are sitting here recording this, as you say, we have not, there has been a stay, but that's a temporary thing, right? So that means something else is going to happen in the state Supreme Court, and I want you to tell me what that is. And then after that, you mentioned that something is still pending, I think you said in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. So maybe you could then tell us what's happening, what are the next things people ought to be looking at?
So the underlying original action in the North Carolina Supreme Court was a writ of prohibition. And so they go on an order from the Supreme Court ordering the State Board of Elections to not certify my election, to not count these ballots. And, that the State Supreme Court is on a schedule now to resolve that end of this month, early next month. I mean, you get the briefing schedule and then you don't quite know how long it'll take after that. But in the Fourth Circuit, we have filed a motion to stay the district court's decision to send the federal cases back to state court. And we've filed a motion to expedite. So we've asked the Fourth Circuit to take this up on the merits and to do it quickly. Our oral arguments at the North Carolina Supreme Court start on February 11th, which is a month from now.
But it's actually very fast for people out there who are wondering. That's actually very fast for a federal court of appeals.
It's very fast. But North Carolina voters have been putting up with this for 66, 67 days.
I know. That's why I pointed out, because I'm sure people were rolling their eyes being like, oh my God, that's so slow. And I wanted them to know, in defense of the court, that's actually not considered slow. It's good fast. It is bad. It is slow for what democracy needs, but it's not unexpected, is I guess what I'm saying.
Yeah. So my legal team is very committed, and I'm very committed, not only to make sure that voters, as they should, get to decide who wins elections, but to resolve this as quickly as possible.
Yeah. So I won't tell you that I was involved in the longest election recounting contest in American history, and it was in Minnesota in 2008, and it didn't resolve itself till July. So, let God willing, it won't go on nearly that far. And so if the federal court of appeals does the stay, then what happens?
I mean, truthfully, we are in uncharted territory.
And if the state Supreme Court, what I guess what I'm trying to ask is, okay, so what is the state Supreme Court like? What happens if they do the thing that they want? Like how does this play forward? on both tracks to the extent you can predict or you have a sense? Is there like a further hearing? Is there an evidentiary hearing? Do things go back to the county? Like, would that be the end of it? Like, what's what? Because you mentioned there are multiple other lawsuits.
Yeah. So we're trying to be careful not to speculate, since there's sort of a near infinite permutation of ways this could play out. What we want folks to understand is this has the potential to be very confusing. This has the potential to be destabilizing. As a constitutional officer, I am pushing for quick and full resolution. So I want my opponent's baseless claims addressed on the merits in the Fourth Circuit, because I don't want this dragging on. Right now, we are arguing these issues as matters of law. Obviously, there hasn't been, sort of what you might call trial proceedings.
Yeah.
And it is our position there does not need to be. What needs to happen is swift resolution of elections, and including post-election disputes. And I'll remind your listeners, I had no problem with recounts. This was a tight
You were clear
election.
about this in the last video.
That I want people to have faith in our electoral system. I think recounts are a very healthy part of it. These recounts were done with complete transparency, with engagement from my attorneys and my opponent's attorneys. No one, I don't think, can fairly fault those procedures. And so, but now the count, I won by 734 votes. That was confirmed by a statewide recount. It was confirmed by a hand-eye sample recount. And it's time to move on.
And Justice Riggs, you've mentioned several times the State Board of Elections. And so most places, people are quite familiar with the Secretary of State. That is not with elections. That is not the case in North Carolina, right? Your Secretary of State, you have a great Secretary of State, by the way, but your Secretary of State does not play a role in this, right? So could you just explain who it is that is being sued and all this? Because I think you said you intervened, but like what's the deal here?
Right. So in other states, secretaries of state administer the elections. Here in North Carolina, under the supervision of the State Board of Elections, the county boards of elections do. But we have a 5-member State Board of Elections. The governor has the authority to make the appointments, made these appointments, I should say. 3 Democrats, 2 Republicans. And this is a State Board of Election that at least some of my opponent's claims have been rejected on a bipartisan basis from that State Board of Elections.
Okay, so they are a critical player in the litigation, in addition to you and your opponent, right? That's kind of the 3 pieces, and then obviously you have political parties and interveners and other kinds of people. But those are okay. I wanted to be clear about that. Okay, so I want to zoom out with like one last question, which is probably impossible for you to like. It's a counterfactual, but I've sat with a lot of candidates who have gone through close elections, and I've sat with a number of them who have had, very close post elections. And it's very, very emotionally difficult. It is emotionally difficult election night, the days after the election, when the votes are coming in and the recount, like it's all just very, very hard. And so I'm just, maybe there's no answer to this. Would you do it again? Or would you be like, you know what? They can find some other person to be a justice on the state Supreme Court. Like, is it worth it? Because I want, like, it really is a trying period that you're through. You're handling it with grace, but it's got to be very difficult.
It is. It's been a long 26 months. I mean, I was running for 2 years, and it's been now over 2 months. I feel like the universe has equipped me for this. And at core, I will say the people of North Carolina kept faith with me. They believed in my commitment to the Constitution. They believed in the vision I painted for them of what it looks like to have a fair and independent judiciary. And the faith that they kept with me, I will keep faith with them and fight for them through this. And it's my great honor to be standing up for their choices.
Okay, so look, I want to say this directly into the camera. I can tell you, I don't know the firsthand, what exactly the needs of the Riggs campaign or the legal defense fund is, but I've been involved in a lot of post-election cases. These are very, very expensive. There is a lot of need for resources because these things go on, and there is, a lot of stop and start with courts. You're in this court, you're in that court, you're going from federal court to state court back to federal court. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff that goes on. And this is an effort that needs to be funded in order to protect democracy, not just protect democracy in this race, not just protect democracy in North Carolina, but this is the fight of our generation. It is to make sure that we have free and fair elections and that people after the fact can't come and disenfranchise 60,000 voters. And what's standing between that and that reality and democracy is the legal team. I don't even really know her. I know who they are, but this is just me speaking here, everyone. Okay, so we're going to put a link below where you can give to the Legal Defense Fund, and I encourage everyone to give because there is nothing more important right now that is going on than this fight in court in North Carolina, and they need resources. So please, donate in that link, find out more information. We'll put a link to Justice Riggs' campaign where you can find out more information on that front. And we'll also try to include a link for people to look up affected voters. And by the way, no one should worry. That's a public list. We didn't, it's not a proprietary list. That's public information in North Carolina. So we will do that as well. We will include all of that information as well as how to follow this issue on Democracy Docket and elsewhere in the notes below. But Justice Riggs, thank you for joining me today, and I hope you continue to come back as this moves forward.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Thanks for joining this episode of Democracy Docket. Please make sure you are a subscriber to Democracy Docket's free daily and weekly newsletter. The links for that and for Justice Riggs' campaign and Legal Defense Fund are in the show notes below. We'll see you next time.